La première intervenante sera Fay Blaney. Fay, qui est membre fondatrice du Aboriginal Women's Action Network de Vancouver. Elle est depuis très longtemps présidente du comité qui organise le mémorial pour les femmes autochtones à Vancouver depuis 25 ans, en fait. Ils organisent cet événement-là le 14 février. Vous avez peut-être aussi déjà participé. Il y en a dans différentes villes à travers le Canada. Et jusqu'à tout récemment, Fay était également intervenante au Downtown Eastside Center de Vancouver, qui est un des endroits où on ne peut nier et tolérer, en fait, malgré les actions de nos gouvernements, le vécu des femmes autochtones, particulièrement, et des populations démunies qui se retrouvent là. Donc, j'inviterai Fay, et je vous demanderai de l'accueillir chaleureusement. Fay, if you want to come here.
So, first of all, I want to pay my respect to the Mohawk Nation, whose territory we currently are on, and give thanks to my relations for allowing us to be on this land. So I wanted to speak to the reality of women in the Downtown Eastside as a starting point for my talk. Yesterday, a report came out from the representative for children and families, and it's hitting the media in BC right now. In her research, she found that this is Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond I'm speaking of. Her research showed that the levels of sexual exploitation and violence against girls that are in the care of the ministry is quite high, and it's extremely high for Indigenous girls. So that's not a big surprise to us in the Indigenous community. We already knew that. But it's now coming out for public consumption, and I'm really appreciating that fact. So the women that I worked with in the Downtown Eastside came out of that system. Many of them did. They came out of the foster care system, were adopted outside of their communities, and often didn't know who they were. Their identity, and they were estranged from their family and their community. And other women were fleeing violence, as I did. If you have the chance to view the film called Finding Dawn, I'm in there, and I speak about my experience of fleeing violence when I was 13 years old. I often speak of two sisters that I worked with in the Downtown Eastside, and their experience is so mind-boggling that it's still going on in this day and age. Those two sisters were being sexually abused within their families. They were being brutalized to such an extreme extent that they fled in their small remote community, and they hid underneath houses. They did that for 4 or 5 years. In their early teens, they were able to escape into the urban setting. And so if that's not a setup to be prostituted, I don't know what is. They're arriving in the streets of the Downtown Eastside in their early teens, and what kind of life can they expect? The women that I worked with in the Downtown Eastside were in extreme poverty, and I think it goes without saying. They also experienced inadequate housing. There were loopholes in the programs that were delivered so that they had no protections that are afforded to other British Columbians through the Residential Tenancy Act. So they could have police officers or managers come into their living quarters at any time of day or night, and they speak of often being sexually assaulted. The biggest frustration that I faced working, one of them anyway, in the Downtown Eastside is the harm reduction policies that are in place. What those policies do is they normalize a certain level of existence, whether it's women in prostitution or if it's alcohol addiction or drug addiction. It just normalizes those realities, and the services in the Downtown Eastside are the benefactors. And I often said to my employer that we were poverty pimps, and she really took offense to that. But in reality, that's what we were. We deliver a service, and it's in our best interest to ensure that the people that we're serving remain in that status quo. And so a lot of Indigenous women are living that reality. If you go onto the website of the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, it does say that about 60% of the service recipients of the center are Indigenous women. And yet, we're not represented in that place. You know, we don't have representation on the board, or if we do, it's not taken seriously. We don't have women in governance or in service delivery. And the work that I did there was to try and build capacity, and it was a social justice group that I ran. And when I took up the issue of prostitution, it wasn't a very popular thing, and I actually entertained the prospect of taking a human rights case against the center because of the ways that they tried to silence me on the issues of prostitution. I was told that if I spoke out against the prostitution of women, that I would drive some of the women away from the center, that I would make it an unwelcome place. And I think on the flip side of that equation, there are a lot of Indigenous women that are compelled to be prostituted and don't fit into the Downtown Eastside when they're not. And I'll get to that a little bit later. So I think what I've just described is the fact that there is deep-seated racism in the Downtown Eastside, despite the 60% or so of Indigenous women that utilize the services of the Downtown Eastside Women's Center. There isn't empowerment or capacity building for Indigenous women. And when I did raise that issue, I was told, we serve all women. And if that sounds familiar, I'm sure you're thinking about Black Lives Matter, and people say all lives matter. And that's what I was hearing in the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, that all women matter, and this isn't about Indigenous women. And Indigenous women are being barred fairly routinely from a whole variety of social services agencies in the Downtown Eastside, so they're forever vulnerable. Now, I wanted to step back just a little bit and speak about the historical, just very briefly, the historical realities that bring us to the places where we are. There was women being prostituted during the fur trade, and the Indian Act reflected that, and I think the Indian Act was a vehicle to promote that norm. It conveyed to the larger society that Indigenous women were lewd, that they were that was our status, was that we were prostitutes. And the Indian Act is very patriarchal. I definitely am not going to go into any details about that. But we do know that the Western patriarchal model was imposed upon our communities, and that left women extremely vulnerable. And on top of that vulnerability, I think what happened with Western patriarchy is that the men enjoyed the power and the benefits that they acquired from this Western model, and they're none too ready to give it up. And in fact, they've adopted a lot of those ways. And the debate going on when we were pressing for an inquiry was the police commissioner saying that a large number of the women were experiencing murder and violence at the hands of Indigenous men. And it was very difficult for Indigenous women to bring out that story. Even in the late 80s, early 90s, Indigenous women were trying to bring out that story that we were experiencing rampant violence in our communities, male violence against women and children. And so I wouldn't stretch that truth to say that it is Indigenous men that are perpetrating the male violence against Indigenous women. They are a part of the problem, but the fact is that a large number of those atrocities are perpetrated by non-Indigenous men from all races, all classes. And I think that was just a red herring that the government was throwing our way anyway. I wanted to speak a bit about the Opel Inquiry and how that made things far worse for Indigenous women in the Downtown Eastside. The outcome of the main things, anyway, the main outcomes of the Opel Inquiry for us in Vancouver was that they allocated $700,000 to WISH, an agency that works with prostituted women. And as Indigenous women, I really believe that we are set up to be prostituted. And I'll leave that to some of the other panelists to describe how it is that we are compelled into those arenas. But mainly what I would like to speak about is the role of the government in trying to impose that upon us. In the allocation of that $700,000 with no exiting service whatsoever, it's pretty dismal. It's very difficult. And in fact, what they do is try to celebrate that life. And so there's no opportunity for Indigenous women to leave, even if they wanted to. There's the champions of the work of prostitution, so they think. The second thing that they did was they brought in a social planner with the city of Vancouver, and she was a representative for Indigenous prostituted women. And the third thing that happened was that there was supposed to be a review of the Sister Watch program. The Sister Watch program came about as a result of the fact that some drug dealers were trying to murder Indigenous women by throwing them out of hotel windows, and the police brushing that off as suicide. And on a personal note, I have a grand-aunt that I never met. She met that fate before I was born. And the reason why she was in the city is because at the age of about 12, 13, she was sexually assaulted on our reserve. And when she pressed charges, the offender, the guy that raped her, ended up in jail. And the community turned against her, her own family and his family and many other families on the reserve. So at a very young age, she was in the city. And shortly thereafter, she was thrown out of one of those windows in the Downtown Eastside. And so women protested the death of Ashley McChisnick in the Downtown Eastside, and Sister Watch came into being. The challenge that I see with the program is that it immediately had its controls. The police had a stranglehold on the way the program ran, and they would not allow women to give testimony of what happened to them in those meetings. It had to be done by a third party. It had to be done with someone that was on the committee. And the woman that was, the Native woman that was on the committee, She really worked hard at ensuring that became an agency that represented prostituted women and not other Indigenous women. And that's a huge problem for me because there are so many Indigenous women that are not in prostitution and that fall through the cracks very severely. They're not recognized by this 700,000 to wish. They're not represented by the Indigenous women's representative, the social planner, and they barely have any voice in Sister Watch. And so now, I don't know how my time is going, 5 minutes, okay. So I just wanted to speak a bit about the National Inquiry on the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. The alarm bells went off for me immediately when it started because the three ministers were talking about a families first agenda. And what I've described at the outset is that there are so many of our women that are not attached to family and to community. They aren't because they're a product of the child welfare system, and they aren't because they fled violence and they never want to look back to the communities that they came from. And so the Families First agenda really alarmed me. And we began organizing in Vancouver with the support of Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. We organized 2 gatherings to talk about this, to raise consciousness, just to interrogate what are the implications of a Families First agenda. And guess who's left out of that equation? It's the marginalized women that are being prostituted. They're the ones that are completely outside of this national inquiry. No one's going to have a look at that. It's the women that have families that are championing their cause that are going to be heard. So it'll look at specific historic cases, but it doesn't do an effective job at examining the status of Indigenous women that are in urban areas that are refugees in our own homelands. The other thing that really disturbs me is that they talk about systemic violence. And there's a couple of things wrong with that. I think the big glaring omission out of systemic violence is the fact that the violence is coming from men. It's male violence against women. And there's no mention of that in the materials that I've seen. And we've tried to raise that as an issue, and we've yet to see if we're going to be taken seriously. We did call for meetings with the ministers, and to no avail. The other issue with systemic violence, i.e. colonization, is that particularly the Justice Minister is interested in examining colonization in its entirety. And I think that is a huge mistake. I think that colonization needs to be examined from a gendered perspective. We experience colonization very differently. Men were put into positions of privilege by the church and by government through the Indian Act, and they have continued to enjoy that privilege. As late as the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the report was telling us that men, despite the fact that they don't achieve the levels of education that Indigenous women do, we were overwhelmingly the ones represented in post-secondary education. And the men were the ones that were chiefs, there were presidents, they were executive directors, they were band managers, they held the high-level positions, and women continued to be the one to do the grunt work. And so that tells me that we have experienced colonization very differently than men. In fact, we had no vote, we had no voice prior to 1951 in land surrenders because of the Indian Act. So men were selling off our Aboriginal rights and title. And in fact, my band was about to take that issue up at one point. And so I think that men in our communities and out of our communities need to be made accountable, and the police need to make them accountable. The police need to enforce the laws, and they're not doing that. And so I'll just end off by saying that, we've paid a lot of lip service to women's leadership in this national inquiry. And I'm terrified at the prospect of Native men having a role, any role, in the inquiry. Leadership, there's a case in Alberta currently where a chief is guilty of sexual assault and trying to evade the law. And I don't know what the numbers are, but I suspect they're very high. My friend Bridget Perrier at the round table rose and confronted the chiefs. She said to them, as a sexually exploited child that was forced into prostitution, she told the chiefs, "You were the Johns that bought me when I was a child." And so I would really throw that caution out there that we can't have male leadership in the inquiry, and it can't be degendered. It has to be from a feminist perspective. I go that far and say it has to be from a feminist perspective. I know a lot of other Indigenous women don't accept that, but I do. It needs to come from a feminist perspective. All my relations.